Okay, so this video is I made a last video about sort of like the death of communication. This video is going to be more so about, again, because I ended the last video off on kind of a bit of a janky footnote saying how, men aren't perfect either. And perfection is defined as, having few to no contradictions. If you know what a contradiction is, it's not just something, it's not a discrepancy. A lot of people say contradiction when they really mean a discrepancy. What a contradiction is when the premise and the only or most obvious conclusion negate each other. That is a contradiction, and so Manhood has a lot of contradictions that are very difficult to sort of navigate, to put it nicely. So we're gonna get into some of that, but let's just start. So, the core issue of Manhood is simply that being good at it and committing spiritual self-death are functionally identical. I just want to say outright that I simply refuse, and at a young age, I think I've already parsed out a lot of the contradictions and deadlocks that entails. So being a, quote, real man is basically just a never-ending free-run trial of masochism, and you are mentally and behaviorally not much more than a slave. Women subtly, but notably, revel in your dolor and misery, only to weep if you were to get taken down or blow your own brains out. The mom of a man's child is always his biggest op. So the charter as we get into this. So this presentation is going to have a few segments, and basically is going to divulge on a few core anthropological and behavioral themes as to how we got here and why this isn't really working. So segment one will be about, what manhood really is. Segment two is how or why we fail at it. Segment three is going to be about some of its inherent contradictions and dead ends. And segment four will be about the games that are played. So, segment one, on the basis of what the thing actually is. So, quote, manhood in the West at least, or anyway, is typically focused on the implication of duty, the exponential of effort, and the willingness to lose one's own life or allow yourself to be replaced. So, boys, put all those things together in your head and realize that this is classic textbook enslavement. I repeat, the implication of duty, or rather I could say even the obligation of duty, that means mitigated or no reward. Exponential effort, that means never stop, that means there is no end point, there's no goal. There is no point where you are redeemed. And the expectation, or even outright demand, to allow yourself or to be okay with being sacked off, done away with, replaced, or ran out, basically. You're a slave. This is enslavement. What do you call a class of people that, at birth, are culturally destined to work for others forever, with no or massively low reward, and have a life whose only or primary value is to be traded, sacked off, or consumed for the sake of someone else? Ladies and gentlemen, the category is whips and chains. That is slavery. That is enslavement, plain and simple. So, earlier it was mentioned that being good at manhood and in some way killing yourself are effectively the same thing. So we're now going to explore at depth how this is the case. So the first contradiction in manhood is that a woman wanting you and a woman hating you are the same thing. So let's break down a partial of how women operate and why you must, quote, count your days every time you please her. But before that, we must also clarify that as the naturally neurotic members of the clan, for a woman to hate, she must also feel unsafe. And for her to feel unsafe, must logically and behaviorally imply for either her or your presence to be temporary. So this is why they op on loyal boyfriends and cute husbands, oftentimes gaslighting his own reputation, claiming the child was born of rape when it was born 3 years into a five-year relationship, etc. All of this, quote, brings us to the Lilith drive. So a lot of this bizarre and misanthropic behavior stems ultimately from what I call the Lilith drive. Basically, it refers to the inherent, pathological, and contrarian control-seeking urge that rests in the ego of some women, which itself is nestled between the mind and spirit. It evolved, I personally believe, from a mixture of survival of the fittest and the first extrasensory contacts with demons and Daedra from previous turns of whatever little wheel we are subordinate to. So this drive is both benefactory and anathemic to a clan survival. It's why humanity's made it this far, and it's also why we have the problems that we do. So it benefits because the pathological control increases resource priority and child safety. but it also sabotages because it incites instability, causes cognitive illness, and brings about the needless death of sons. So back to the construct of manhood, I'll now explain how you can never please her. So in order for her to want to mate or nest with you, you must be able to offer material safety, mental functionality, and sexual formidability, and some degree of spiritual self-sustainability. Anything less than this, and she would simply be setting herself up were she to get with you. The problem is, actually having those things makes it ontologically impossible for her to control you, which means her investment of any kind is not inherently secure. This makes her neurotic as fuck, and she will become passive aggressive and paranoid psychotic as a self soothing mechanism, which will get the man derailed or eventually killed. So there's an inherent disconnect between the final goal and the intended method. So let's create a random realistic example. So let's say meet Brando, right? He's 5'11", he works at a futuristic company called Supertech. He can cook, he can reasonably hold his own in a fair fight, and he lives in a pretty ritzy, decent scale district. So his cock is a smooth 7.4, and his balls have a good scent. Emily wants him, of course. The only glaring issue is that with all of those traits, okay, Brando has no inherent reason or direct incentive to want Emily. And even if he did, he could shift to Sierra or Paris should Emily not give him what he wants. Emily knows this, so she starts a rumor that he's going to get fired from Supertech in order to shoo off other suitors. The rumor works. There's suddenly only one problem. Emily is now the only bad bitch in town who's dating a guy that's not working at Supertech. She's such a loser, right? Says Wendy. Sierra and Paris bust out laughing. So Emily could have started rumors about the other girls, but that would have gotten her exposed easily and likely jumped. There's simply no way for Emily to get Brando to date or mate with her with high guarantee. The only ontologically sound option is for her to sabotage Brando himself, with him being the most culturally isolated and spiritually undefended. So you can see the contradiction arising where bashing that mate and attracting that mate from the female ontology are kind of the same thing, or for the woman's ontology rather. So, as in any timeline where Emily achieves in scoring Brando, she will probably, drumroll please, lose respect for him anyway. Because why the fuck would you want to make a baby with someone who was too dumb or slow to clock what was going on here anyway? Why would you want to vest the safety of the rest of your life in someone who was so easily manipulated or gaslit or set up? Of course not. So, women frequently claim to, quote, get bored of men who are also checking every box she's ever comprehended or asked for. When she says that, what she really means is, I have lost the ability to observe a reward for playing mental or spiritual games on him. As soon as her pathology becomes predictable to him, she copes with ego death by withdrawing sexual attention or relational appeal. So, for a more diegetic or fictional example, let's look at the Drow from Dungeons and Dragons. And I'll just be frank, they've completely failed as a species, and I'll explain why. So, in Drow culture, misandry is basically the state religion. Males are worked to death, randomly and ritually humiliated, they're cursed or deformed using magic, or are enslaved and tortured in droves to the point of being completely and irreparably insane. Some matron mothers sell their own sons as slaves. Every day, hundreds of perfectly healthy, mentally well and peak physique males are worked to death in the shafts of two hellish dimensions called the Demon Web Pit and the Underdark. And all of this over time goes about as well as you expect. So, the constant death of perfectly fine males causes massive labor shortages, which means the surviving Drow females have to import or kidnap massive amounts of immigrants to be manual labor slaves. Another thing is that noble houses constantly go extinct because the women have no one to breed with. What few males that somehow manage to survive become grand wizards, and they're basically treated like harem princes because their sperm is that valuable. So it's kind of funny that like you really just can't. The male and the man are they're two forms of species that cannot be done in no matter what. Because what misandry does is causes our numbers to drop so severely, so much so that the only way for the population to remain stable or just survive at all is to cater to the ones who are left. So in a very sort of roundabout, ironic, full circle effect way, hating men or setting males up that badly really just kind of circles around to boosting them. But that's another conversation. Like, I won't get into that. That's sort of, like I said, the horseshoe effect is really a fascinating thing, but we can get into that another time. Um, the constant, the point overall is that the constant slaughter of husbands, brothers, and boyfriends completely destroys cultural and diplomatic relations, putting Dro territory in states of constant embargo and warfare. Revolt and insurrection happen almost constantly. In order to save the population, matron mothers have to constantly outsource intelligent labor to non-Dro because teaching males serious knowledge is basically a blasphemy. Over time, Dro become a minority in their own capital, which is a place called Menzoberranzan. It has, according to lore, you can look this up if you don't believe me, it canonically has 80,000 residents total, but only 20,000 of them being actually Dro. In order to prevent a revolt, the remaining Menzoberranzan matriarchs must create a completely debauched and hedonic culture to serve as a constant distraction from the sheer wickedness of it all. Upon realizing their ways, surface people begin sending raiding parties and warbands into the Underdark to make sure that, just the sheer malevolence of their ways just does not spread, as a containment protocol, effectively. So, overall, in all, the Dro completely failed as a species. And due to the corruption of the matrons, decisions in Menzoberranzan are completely random and arbitrary. Old buildings are never repaired. Nothing is ever done in a direct or simple fashion. Filth piles up next to glamorized districts, and men are gaslit into fighting each other for scraps, while males are denigrated to the role of party boy or eye candy. Some matrons are so misandrous that they literally just sacrifice their sons to a demon goddess called Loth, only to later complain their daughter can't find a husband. Does any of this sound familiar? This concludes segment 1. Segment 2, Born to Fail. So that's what you are, boy. In segment 1, we talked about how the Lilith tribe is inherently contrarian. It's also very Oedipal and perverted, but we'll talk about that later. If you don't know what contrarianism is, it's a behavioral ideology focused on creating maximal layers of, quote, plausible deniability in order to effectively psyop other people into never having a point or being correct, thus allowing you to make infinite moral demands. Women are basically hardwired for it, or at least it would so seem. It works in 3 layers, which I'll break down now. They are projecting, deflecting, and conflating. So before you understand projecting, you have to know different communication styles. So one of them is prescriptive, that is what you feel should be. Another is descriptive, which is what you think is or will be. Example, smile beautiful is prescriptive. Quote, she seems sad right now is descriptive. Projection is when someone swaps descriptive for prescriptive, but still pretends that it's descriptive anyway. So, being contrarian always starts with some type of projection. Example, someone sits down at a bar, someone who's fat as fuck wants that seat because it's next to the aircon unit. Fatty says, very loudly, there's not enough room in here, some people are so rude. Bitch, shut up. So after projecting, we have deflecting. That is when someone takes logic and swaps it with an implication. So for example, if you ask a supervisor, I thought we were supposed to be paid by now. And he responds, I think everyone's put in a lot of effort. He is deflecting. You asked a direct question about where your money was at, and he responds by making it seem like you were shading a coworker. Swapping logic and implications for one another causes randomness and confusion due to the brain not knowing which area to trigger in response. This delays the victim's ability to predict outcomes, assess facts, or detect threats. So, the final aspect of being contrarian or pathological neurotic is conflating. So, I'll just be frank, bitches in particular do this when they stopped having a point about 15 minutes ago. I want you to be aware that there is no knowledge or serious thought train or cognitive honesty in this behavior whatsoever. This is purely a tactic of emotional masturbation, spiritual self-soothing, or psychological coping. It can sometimes also serve as ego management or reputation coordination. Conflating is when someone takes a compromise or opinion and swaps it with a comparison. It can also sometimes be called false equating, tit for tat, or fake examples. Like I said earlier, there is no logic whatsoever in this behavior. It exists as a primitive, regressive, borderline degenerate form of petty negotiation or rival sabotage. So, an example, Emily and Brando are arguing over chocolate shake or strawberry scoop. The shop owner says, chocolate is our most popular flavor, but we've been open all day, so we kind of ran out of it a while ago. So factually and physically, the material implement of reality, Emily's shake is no longer an option. But she's already existentially and emotionally invested in getting one. A functioning adult would just get the scoop or get a shake elsewhere. But Emily would probably say something to the shop owner like, well, yeah, but I bought him a coffee last time, so it's not really making sense. I mean, he picked me up late too, but yeah, I'll have the chocolate shake. The owner would simply stare at her. So as I mentioned earlier, we talked about the Lilith drive, but the Artemis drive comes from the lowermost middle of the brain. I call it this because it's more so about, I mean, it's a preternatural call to violence. There's no other way about it. So that's why I call it the Artemis drive. But in other words, the fact that the shop owner is completely out has literally not, it's not deployed. That ship cannot dock in Emily's, like, cognitive harbor. It's literally not checking in her comprehension of reality. The frontal lobe is completely inactive during the state. She's operating on pure id and a very perverted and egoistic sense of libido. So she's suffering from existential psychosis, in which, an arrogant disconnect from reality causes her to be unable to understand why something is happening to her. She views the lack of a chocolate shake as a fundamental assault on her existence. So she throws Brando under the bus, revealing hidden hatred and animosity over random mishaps or harmless misunderstandings, like him picking her up slightly late or her buying him a coffee last week. She was attempting to negotiate with the shop owner by trading emotional blows. She actually expected a chocolate shake to appear after mentioning a random coffee from a week ago. So shop owner met this couple like 10 minutes ago. The coffee means nothing to him. And again, why would you even keep track of this? Why is buying coffee for your fucking boyfriend for ever many months of years? Why is it even something you register in your membrane as a slight against yourself? And women do this all the time. They just don't comprehend it. Do you not love me? Does he not do stuff like that for you all the time? What are you upset about actually? Where does this vitriol come from? You know what I mean? So this behavior creates what I call the lawyer complex. So this is when someone's mind is fundamentally removed from the input, observe, reality mechanism. So in other words, they view everything that happens to them as a subjective discourse rather than a factual event. In simple terms, in other words, they will try to debate or co-parent with the laws of reality themselves. They are cognitively insane, and they are willing to literally argue forever about anything in hopes of changing the result. They cannot be trusted to make serious changes or accurately respond to basic information. This can happen to with everybody. And I've had it from guys, had it from dudes, had it from chicks. Again, it can be a universal human thing, but I do have to be honest that from what I can tell, women seem to be particularly vulnerable to this because they must communicate through layers of abstraction as their only means of threat detection or dodging. So this is why women in relationships frequently pit their husbands against impossible odds. She's trying to use his life or death or his state or lack thereof as a form of by proxy negotiation. Basically, women are always in a state of Cold War. So she can never bring it to just be straight up because bar for bar communication negates ambiguity, which means she has no cultural or reputational fallback if this goes incorrect. In her mind, being wrong, being technically incorrect, being harmlessly clueless, and being terminally endangered are all the same thing. So some women literally feel like they're about to die when given mildly difficult or troubling information. So this, when combined with the Lilith and Artemis drives, causes a complete cognitive spiral that implicates every man around her with absurdly high stakes. So every conversation feels like a maze or an eggshell parkour course or a death game. But here's one about it. If you actually guess right or correct, you're predicting her mentality, which makes her feel like you can spiritually or psychologically control her, so she must rebel in order to justify her existence or some sense of free will. So women with loving husbands, idyllic relationships, and healthy sons frequently say things like, "I feel trapped." This is what she means. If all else fails, she will probably attempt to conduct warfare. So, warfare is defined as a state of combat where one never, ever strikes the target directly. So, this is usually accompanied by rumors, child custody antics, and playing dumb. So, during times of trouble, women also become extremely slutty and ran out. This is because she's using sexuality to try and proxy control the man who's fucking her into harming or sabotaging the man she's mad at. She is gatekeeping sexual needs or the possibility of having children until another man has been, quote, out of the picture, or until the local dark sheep male has been humiliated or target neutralized. So she is a sower of discord and in-group conflict. So that concludes segment 2 on why some women aren't to be trusted. But men aren't better off by default, and manhood has some of its own serious contradictions, regardless of the input of women. So the three main ones are the fail son complex, the loyal daughter contradiction, and the provider of home conundrum. So we'll go through all of these in a direct and clear manner before coming back around, and this is going to start off segment 3. So the fail son complex is a complex that the father develops when he observes his son either being better than him at something or being himself to a degree too far removed. So this is a bit of a contradiction because of the simple ontology here. If the son is just a, quote, carbon copy of the father will often feel like he raised a fool, a lackey, or dummy, and will lose respect for son due to the apparent absence or vanishment of things like free will or personality. However, if son chooses to be himself, and is somewhat good at that much, father will often feel enraged, insulted, or threatened that his, quote, legacy is not being upheld or continued. It's a double bind. A father will despise him either way. Next up is the loyal daughter contradiction. So I'll be blunt. The whole point of having a daughter is a genetic stabilizer and cultural backup unit. That's what a daughter is. However, this is not logically possible so long as mom's in the picture. It's no secret moms are oftentimes crippled by burning jealousy of their daughters, especially when she's good at following father's instructions, because the Lilith and Artemis drives make mom pathologically rebellious and neurotic narcissistic, and she will also feel emotionally and sexually threatened because father's attention is divided. However, if daughter is not loyal or fairly behaved, mom will look like a bad parent, and she will have, functionally speaking, completely failed at such. So mom will hate daughter for acting this way, but would also view her as spiritual, as a spiritual and sexual threat should she get her act together. So there's no solution between these two, and the, quote, man of the house he is doomed to be a proxy or pawn between them. So next up is the provider of the home conundrum. So this was one of the more simpler of among the three contradictions of manhood. So if he's good at providing, this exudes soft pressure on the wife's role and the roles of other men, effectively causing him to become the target of the, quote, community's random, jealous, or petty dealings. If he's bad at providing, wife will ritually humiliate him, withhold sex, play custody games, quote, get a better man, etc. Basically, if he does his job, he gets low-key hated for it. If he doesn't do his job, he gets left to the wayside. If he tries to ride her fickle waves, she will feel like she's dating another woman. If he's in tune with her, she'll feel like she's with a bitch. And so she will become spiritually schizophrenic and emotionally volatile. So all options end in separation or resentment. And that's just the way it kind of is. And this concludes segment 3. So this will start to bring us to closing, where we'll touch on, quote, the game. I'll just say outright, it's a total construct with no real rules, prize, or fair scorekeeper. Most of it is completely arbitrary and based on ego. It's arguably a figment of the prole's dumb imagination, and if you, quote, follow the lines, you'll find that a lot of it is pushed by moguls, heirloom families, and media tyrants who are just trying to keep you stupid and distracted. But that's not the conversation. This apparent game has a lot of gimmicks to it, but the main one that all boils down to is coversion. So if you don't know what being covert is, it's when someone swaps sabotage for understanding. I repeat, being covert is when sabotage and understanding have swapped locations in someone's behavioral register. It can take many forms, but the most common and run-of-the-mill versions are reputation or romantic life. So the goal of coversion is usually to mitigate competition or dummy check biases. While the behavior can sometimes be quite convoluted or drawn out, thus providing the illusion of sophistication, it is ultimately a primitive, amoral, and oftentimes knee-jerk behavior. People who engage in it tend to do so in a fashion that is cowardly or in many layers of the abstract. Don't be impressed by it, but don't let your guard down either. So, true story. I was at a bar not far from my residential, just shooting the shit. I guess the conversations were kind of just wandering around, wandering around. On the topic of attraction, I promptly outed myself as bisexual. This got the attention of three people: one hunky white guy, two a goth chick, and the woman in a cardigan. So once he heard that, Hunky started like strike up talk to me. You know, he was jeans, kind of jockey, a little fuzzy all over, like super cute, really fuckable. Cardigan blurts out to me, "Oh, you're just a total playboy, aren't you?" I kind of just made a look. I was never really talking to that bitch, but I made small talk with Goth while Hunky went across the layout to play pool. Cardigan says under her breath, shortly after that, like, some of us need something a little bit more serious, you know? And I was like, huh. I decided to just sort of people watch her a bit, and so Goth goes off to the bathroom. Cardigan then gets up and approaches Hunky. So she strikes up a chat with him, saying very loudly things like, "Yeah, and it's just like be yourself, like I totally support, and it's like you'll get a man one day," like that sort of things. And I think the problem innately is that Hunky was just fucking gay. He's not a real ass homosexual. So we still seem to be operating under the ditzy and dumb impression that straight women are his friends. Anyway, I went to the bar stool to maybe get another drink. At this time, Goth came back and wished me goodbye. She had stuff to do. We were kind of just chatting a bit. I ultimately just chose to sober up and get a water. Cardigan watches this little interaction and abruptly, like literally rips herself from her conversation with her friends, like just completely abruptly, gets back up from her friends group, beelines to Hunky and says, "I think he's made up his mind," while while sort of like like pointing, sort of gesturing towards me while Goth heads out the door. And Hunky seems completely crestfallen, and just what happened next pissed me off so fucking bad. The satanic irony is that she wasn't even a gay chaser. Her own husband. I scan her up and down and see Ring, and he walks into the ring too. Her own husband walked into the room and made himself at home right next to her. Not even a moment later. What the fuck did she do that for? What did she cockblock me for? Like, what was the point of that? So on the topic of coercion, this is just a fantastic example. So the statement, "Oh, you're just a playboy, aren't you?" is a complete fucking insult. So saying this makes Hunky, gay, compare himself unneededly to women, and it signals to Goth, who's open to the idea, that I will, quote, bail or be behaviorally unfit. So this was in no way at all a compliment. And she has a Freudian slip by saying that some people need to be more serious mere moments after allegedly hyping me up for having supposed, quote, play. She tries to make me feel good while also releasing a double entendre that made me essentially unlovable to everyone else in the bar that night, only for her to actually have her own partner and for him to make himself manifest just a moment after all my options left, effectively. And then to spend, again, I will give her some degree of credit, she spent the rest of the night effortlessly minding her own fucking business, only after all of my healthy and obvious options were dusted off. Like, bitches are just completely two-faced, and she must have done this out of some type of sociopathic boredom, because to cockblock a total strain, like a total random, while you yourself are married and have your friend group there, like, it was just weird. The whole thing was just weird as fuck. But all my life, I pretty much avoided compliments, like the plague, so to speak. And it's actually done me massive favors, actually. I found that most of them almost always contain some sort of label or presumption or inlaid insult or secondary descriptor underneath the veneer of positiveness. So the goal is to get you to accept someone else's label without suspicion, so they can run some type of op on you, then gaslight you by pretending to be holding you to your own word or self-description. So notice when a compliment is later down the line followed up by things like, "Well, because you insert compliment, you can't." But you did say that insert compliment, right? Okay, but because you're insert quote compliment, and I love that for you, it's just that, you should run, they're opping on you, plain and simple. So I want to end this off with a bit of, I guess, nihilistic enlightenment, that especially in urban or troubled environments, competing for sex, status, and or shelter is the primary and default motivator for human entities. Sort of, a rover drive, if you will. Things like ethics, trust, and the benefit of seriousness are oftentimes completely downstream, if they ever come up at all. The better or more intelligent a person you are, the less friends or allies you will have. So far as I've been able to observe, this is simply the truth. When given an answer they don't like, spiritually immature people will mostly just resort to mind games as a form of negotiation tactic. Physical threats are real, but they're ultimately rare. I'm not a doomer or anything like that, but I've simply had to shed some of my knowledge bearing load and be for real about the fact that this culture has rotted in some ways, and to be a man or male means to be cooked in many. In any case, the best way for safety is to stay aware and mind your business.